We're talking about the ethics of equal employment opportunity. And the agency that this statute that we're going to talk about created is indeed called the EEOC, for Equal Employment Opportunity. So it's meant to be equal. It's not meant to be specialized, okay? And certainly it's not meant to be all whites in firms and companies. And many companies are focusing on diversification right now. And that does not mean that the rest of us that are applying for positions shouldn't be, also equally in the running. I do want to tell you one thing you may notice in the College of Business. We have almost zero Hispanic professors. And this, I think, is a real problem. Because if you look at our student population, right, we have many, many Hispanic students. So the problem is that we're not encouraging the Hispanic students in the way we should be towards getting PhDs and becoming professors. So that's another whole issue that our various academic organizations are trying to work on. And it needs to start earlier in the system. But if anyone in this class is interested possibly in becoming a professor, feel free to talk to me and or my husband, and we're happy to share information about that. The one thing I do want to say to you is if you are accepted into a PhD program, they pay your tuition. Usually you do a little bit of student teaching, you make some income, and so on and so forth. So don't feel that you're shut out because you wouldn't have the money to go to graduate school. I think that's a misperception. Okay, so the ethics of equal employment opportunity. Now, we all know, right, that there's been a history of employment discrimination with some companies and some states more than others. So literally, in the southern states, companies would run, back in the days when they ran ads in the newspaper, they would put their job in there and then they'd say, blacks do not apply blacks, right? We will not be hiring any blacks. I mean, it was that blatant of employment discrimination. And so for a long time, it had been necessary. Now, that there be federal legislative change that would apply to all 50 states instead of letting the individual states decide for themselves, because there are some states that will decide in a discriminatory manner if that kind of advertising for a job was challenged. Now, because we also with women, right? I even had, when I graduated from law school, I had workers' compensation background, as you guys know, in employment law. And I thought I'd like to go into employment law. This was before I knew I'd be teaching. And so I was applying to a labor law firm, and the senior partner called me in and he said, with your experience, we'd really like to hire you. But with all those kids you have, there's a lot of traveling involved and we don't think you could do it. Which was just amazing to me. It's up to my family and to me whether I can do it or not. And so we're talking about very recent things. Somewhere I've set aside, I'm going to show you and read to you. There's an Ernst & Young case where women were being trained, seriously, in recent times, okay, how to handle working with the men. Don't be too emotional. Don't wear provocative clothing, which I can't imagine you're going to on an audit anyway, but et cetera, et cetera. And so there's been a long history of employment discrimination against both minorities and women. All right, so let's start with the definition of discrimination for our purposes. Every word in this definition is important. So let's look at it, right? Treating similar people. The similar means in terms of qualifications. Similar people differently on the basis of race, gender, national origin, etc. Other categories have been added over time by the Supreme Court, right? But it's treating people differently. Okay, so let's take two situations. Let's take one situation where what it says in the ad is no blacks need apply. And in the other ad, it says you need to have a bachelor's degree in business to apply. That will treat people differently too. But what's the difference between the two? Why does our gut tell us one's completely wrong and the other is not?
One is based off like skin color and one is based off like education level.
Very good, very good. And so let's dive deeper in that, right? So one is based on skin color. Skin color is something with which we are born. It is not our merit, right? So you can treat people differently, perhaps on the basis of their merit, their qualifications, but solely treating them different based on things like their race, gender, religion also comes up. There's a religious case we're going to talk about. Feels wrong and is wrong ethically. And as we're going to see, is wrong legally. Now, I do want to step back and say none of this is criminalized. So where we saw in securities law that we've just finished with insider trading, financial statement misrepresentation like Aaron Beam, those cases had potential criminal liability. In equal employment opportunity law, it's all civil liability, suing for money. All right, so as Michelle just said, where's my pen to write down Michelle's name? Hang on one second. I need, here's a pen. Okay. All right, and okay. So today is March 25th. Michelle Pablo. I have two Michelles, right? You're both here today. Michelle Pablo and Michelle Escalera, I think. I can't see that.
Yes.
There you guys are. Good to see your faces. Okay, so this takes us to see the immutable characteristic, right? Can we change the skin color with which we are born? No.
I mean,
right?
Technically you can. Example is Michael Jackson, but
Well, yes, technically,
it's very, very rare.
Very
extremely rare.
So for our purposes, I mean, one of the things that broke my heart in being in India is their beauty industry was so heavily focused on lightening your skin and creams that could lighten your skin. And their skin is beautiful, just as it is. And one of the things I noticed in going to Brazil, to a city where it was 80% Black. So you really stood out if you were not Black. And that everyone in that city thought, look at my beautiful, like I remember my guide Wilson saying, look at my beautiful Black skin, but do you see I have red in it too because my mother is part Indian. So, and I thought, what a beautiful thing. What a beautiful thing. The whole world should be like that. All right, But so the immutable characteristic, it's considered something we cannot change. Now, as Denny points out with the skin color, this is also true with gender, right? But for purposes of this statute right now, we're considering gender to also be an immutable characteristic for purposes of the statute in terms of trying to establish discrimination. Versus behavior, right? So my mentor at Cal State Long Beach in the College of Business, we wrote 14 academic papers together, was Black and from the South and older than I. And so she had experienced, a lot of deeply troubling treatment. So here's what would happen. I'm going to give you an education example of what would happen in those states. Okay, equal but separate education, right? This was before Brown versus Board of Education. Well, okay, it's going to be equal but separate. So we won't have the Black students going to school with the white students. Okay. So the white school was this beautiful brick building. I drove by both of the ones that used to exist. Close, right in the center of town, and had buses that took the students to school because it was a rural county. The Black school was very dilapidated, and guess what? Had no buses. So they were providing educational opportunity, but if the students couldn't make it in. So my mentor, Barbara George, her father, who had some extra money because they inherited some property and had a store, bought a school bus. And he got all the Black parents together and they set up a schedule. They would start at 6 in the morning and it took them more than 2 hours to pick up all the Black kids and bring them to the school. And then at the end of the day, they would do the same thing. All the parents volunteered and rotated. That was a pretty strong commitment to education. But it points out the example of why, this whole concept that was primarily in the South, but not always, of, equal but separate is a failure. And of course, it's a failure most of all, because to separate people on CNC, an immutable characteristic, define that as something we cannot change. And we're going to, for our purposes, of course, include race and gender. Versus, as Michelle said, behavior, which is something we can control. So you may think, okay, well, a restaurant can't say we don't serve Blacks as it used to in the South. However, it can say we don't serve people without shoes, right? And how can they do that? They're treating similar people differently. Well, because choosing to wear shoes or not is a behavioral issue. Also, it has something to do with hygiene laws that restaurants have to follow. All right, let's think about the rights. What is the harm that occurs when there is discrimination of any type? We'll move into employment discrimination in a minute. The Civil Rights Act covers all kinds of discrimination. What is the harm? What fundamental human right is harmed?
Liberty, right to liberty.
Okay, right to liberty. Yeah, many times that has been the case, especially in the discrimination and racist policies of policing. But also, what else do you think?
The right to equal opportunity.
Okay, you guys are right. Who's saying equal opportunity? Who just said that? Michael and Michelle?
I was gonna say that too, yeah.
Okay. My other Michelle. Okay, very good. That's exactly it. We expect, notice what Denny said. When he's applying for internships, he expects to be treated equally, right? We all should have that right. That's why affirmative action is its own ethical issue. All right. Now, so the harm is, could be right to liberty, could be right to equal treatment, right to equal access to education, right? And while we're not guaranteed a job, that's not a fundamental human right that we're guaranteed in our Constitution or anything, the right to be treated equally in employment decisions. So let's put that, the right to be treated not just equally, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on employment decisions. All right. So let's look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I'll tell you a number of things. The Southern states fought this statute, fought it, and fought it. There are different parts of the statute. There's one that covers no discrimination in, they call it public accommodations. That means there were many hotels in the Southern states that would not allow Blacks to stay there. And we know the bus issue too, right? The very famous bus issue, which you may have studied in other classes. So there were many areas of discrimination that needed to be covered by this statute. In regard to public accommodations, restaurants or hotels, a couple of interesting anecdotes. Have any of you heard of John Wooden, the coach at UCLA, that was considered a very, very ethical man? So he had a UCLA winning team, and they were going to play Southern universities. And so they get to those states, and they wouldn't let his Black players stay in the hotel. So he took all his players, and they all went and stayed at the quote Black hotel. And so, I mean, these kinds of treatment, these kinds of decisions, right, when we look back in them, are so appalling. But they're not as far gone as we would think. So one of the things that I'll tell you, and this is just anecdotal, it's not about employment, it's about public accommodations, but so you get the idea. So all these cases went to the Supreme Court. And it was actually President Johnson that signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. So the first case, we are local hotel in Birmingham, Alabama. And we have the right to discriminate against anybody we choose. The federal government has no right to regulate us. And so then the question became, did the federal government have the authority to regulate public accommodations in all states? And ultimately, because the Supreme Court wanted to support this statute, they would say, local restaurant or local hotel, you get customers that come to you on the highways. And so we have the authority as the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, so we can regulate you. Next case, Billy Bob's Barbecue. Billy Bob's Barbecue brings a lawsuit. Now, obviously, there was a lot of money. It wasn't Billy Bob. There was a lot of money from Southern donors that supported these lawsuits all through the system.